Good Country People by Flannery O'Connor. Besides the neutral expression that she wore when she was alone, Mrs. Freeman had two others, forward and reverse, that she used for all her human dealings. Her forward expression was steady and driving, like the advance of a heavy truck. Her eyes never swerved to left or right, but turned as a story turned, as if they followed a yellow line down the center of it. She seldom used the other expression, because it was not often necessary for her to retract a statement. But when she did, her face came to a complete stop. There was an almost imperceptible movement of her black eyes, during which they seemed to be receding. And then the observer would see that Mrs. Freeman, though she might stand there as real as several grain sacks thrown on top of each other, was no longer there in spirit. As for getting anything across to her when this was the case, Mrs. Hopewell had given it up. She might talk her head off. Mrs. Freeman could never be brought to admit herself wrong to any point. She would stand there, and if she could be brought to say anything, it was something like, "Well, I wouldn't have said it was, and I wouldn't have said it wasn't," or letting her gaze range over the top kitchen shelf, where there was an assortment of dusty bottles. She might remark, "I see you ain't ate any of them figs you put up last summer." They carried on their most important business in the kitchen at breakfast. Every morning Mrs. Hopewell got up at 7 o'clock and lit her gas heater and Joy was her daughter, a large blonde girl who had an artificial leg. Mrs. Hopewell thought of her as a child, though she was 32 years old and highly educated. Joy would get up while her mother was eating, and lumber into the bathroom and slam the door, and before long Mrs. Freeman would arrive at the back door. Joy would hear her mother call, "Come on in," and then they would talk for a while in low voices that were indistinguishable in the bathroom. By the time Joy came in, they had usually finished the weather report, and were on one or the other of Mrs. Freeman's daughters, Glennice or Cara May. Joy called them Glycerin and Caramel. Glennice, a redhead, was 18 and had many admirers. Cara May, a blonde, was only 15 but already married and pregnant. She could not keep anything on her stomach. Every morning Mrs. Freeman told Mrs. Hopewell how many times she had vomited since the last report. Mrs. Hopewell liked to tell the people that Glennice and Cara May were two of the finest girls she knew, and that Mrs. Freeman was a lady, and that she was never ashamed to take her anywhere or introduce her to anybody they might meet. Then she would tell how she had happened to hire the Freemans in the first place, and how they were a godsend to her, and how she had had them for 4 years. The reason for her keeping them so long was that they were not trash. They were good country people. She had telephoned the man whose name they had given as a reference, and he had told her that Mr. Freeman was a good farmer, but that his wife was the nosiest woman ever to walk the earth. "She's got to be into everything," the man said. "If she don't get there before the dust settles, you can bet she's dead, that's all. She'll want to know all your business." "I can stand him real good," he said, "but me nor my wife neither could have stood that woman one more minute on this place." That had put Mrs. Hopewell off for a few days. She had hired them in the end, because there were no other applicants, but she had made up her mind beforehand exactly how she would handle the woman. Since she was a type who had to be into everything, then, Mrs. Hopewell had decided, she would not only let her be into everything, she would see to it that she was into everything. She would give her the responsibility of everything. She would put her in charge. Mrs. Hopewell had no bad qualities of her own, but she was able to use other people's in such a constructive way that she had kept them for years. Nothing is perfect. That was one of Miss Hopewell's favorite sayings. Another was, "That's life." And still another, the most important, was, "Well, other people have their opinions too." She would make these statements usually at the table, in a tone of gentle insistence, as if no one held them but her, and the large, hulking Joy, whose constant outrage had obliterated every expression from her face, would stare just a little to the side of her, her eyes icy blue, with the look of someone who had achieved blindness by an act of will and means to keep it. When Mrs. Hopewell said to Mrs. Freeman that life was like that, Mrs. Freeman would say, "I always said so myself." Nothing had been arrived at by anyone that had not first been arrived at by her. She was quicker than Mr. Freeman. When Mrs. Hopewell said to her, after they had been on the place for a while, "You know you're the wheel behind the wheel," and winked, Mrs. Freeman had said, "I know it. I've always been quick. It's some that are quicker than others." "Everybody is different," Mrs. Hopewell said. "Yes, most people is," Mrs. Freeman said. "It takes all kinds to make the world. I always said it did myself." The girl was used to this kind of dialogue for breakfast, and more of it for dinner. Sometimes they had it for supper, too. When they had no guests, they ate in the kitchen because that was easier. Mrs. Freeman always managed to arrive at some point during the meal, and to watch them finish it. She would stand in the doorway if it were supper, but in the winter she would stand with one elbow on top of the refrigerator and look down at them, or she would stand by the gas heater lifting the back of her skirt slightly. Occasionally she would stand against the wall and roll her head from side to side. At no time was she in any hurry to leave. All this was very trying on Mrs. Hopewell, but she was a woman of great patience. She realized that nothing is perfect, and that in the Freeman she had good country people, and that if, in this day and age, you get good country people, you had better hang on to them. She had plenty of experience with trash. Before the Freeman, she had averaged one tenant family a year. The wives of these farmers were not the kind you would want to be around you for very long. Mrs. Hopewell, who had divorced her husband long ago, needed someone to walk over the fields with her. And when Joy had to be impressed for these services, her remarks were usually so ugly and her face so glum that Mrs. Hopewell would say, "If you can't come pleasantly, I don't want you at all." To which the girl, standing square and rigid-shouldered, with her neck thrust slightly forward, would reply, "If you want me, here I am, like I am." Mrs. Hopewell excused this attitude because of the leg, which had been shot off in a hunting accident when Joy was 10. It was hard for Mrs. Hopewell to realize that her child was 32 now, and that for more than 20 years she had only one leg. She thought of her still as a child because it tore her heart to think instead of the poor, stout girl in her 30s who had never danced a step or had any normal good times. Her name was really Joy, but as soon as she was 21 and away from home, she had had it legally changed. Mrs. Hopewell was certain that she had thought and thought until she had hit upon the ugliest name in any language. Then she had gone and had the beautiful name Joy changed without telling her mother until after she had done it. Her legal name was Holga. When Mrs. Hopewell thought the name Holga, she thought of the broad, blank hull of a battleship. She would not use it. She continued to call her Joy, to which the girl responded, but in a purely mechanical way. Holga had learned to tolerate Mrs. Freeman, who saved her from taking walks with her mother. Even Glennice and Caramay were useful when they occupied attention that might otherwise have been directed at her. At first she had thought she could not stand Mrs. Freeman, for she had found it was not possible to be rude to her. Mrs. Freeman would take on strange resentments, and for days together she would be sullen. But the source of her displeasure was always obscure. A direct attack, a positive leer, blatant ugliness to her face, these never touched her. And without warning one day, she began calling her Holga. She did not call her that in front of Mrs. Hopewell, who would have been incensed, but when she and the girl happened to be out of the house together, she would say something and add the name Holga to the end of it, and the big, spectacled Joy Holga would scowl and redden as if her privacy had been intruded upon. She considered the name her personal affair. She had arrived at it first purely on the basis of its ugly sound, and then the full genius of its fitness had struck her. She had a vision of the name working like the ugly, sweating Vulcan who stayed in the furnace, and to whom, presumably, the goddess had to come when called. She saw it as the name of her highest creative act. One of her major triumphs was that her mother had not been able to turn her dust into joy, but the greater one was that she had been able to turn it herself into Holga. However, Mrs. Freeman's relish for using the name only irritated her. It was as if Mrs. Freeman's beady, steel-pointed eyes had penetrated far enough behind her face to reach some secret fact. Something about her seemed to fascinate Mrs. Freeman, and then one day Holga realized that it was the artificial leg. Mrs. Freeman had a special fondness for the details of secret infections, hidden deformities, assaults upon children. Of diseases, she preferred the lingering or incurable. Holga had heard Mrs. Hopewell give her the details of the hunting accident, how the leg had been literally blasted off, how she had never lost consciousness. Mrs. Freeman would listen to it any time, as if it had happened an hour ago. When Holga stumped into the kitchen in the morning, she would walk without making the awful noise, but she made it. She could walk without making the awful noise, but she made it. Mrs. Hopewell was certain, because it was ugly sounding. She glanced at them and did not speak. Mrs. Hopewell would be in her red kimono, with her hair tied around her head in rags. She would be sitting at the table finishing her breakfast, and Mrs. Freeman would be hanging by her elbow outward from the refrigerator, looking down at the table. Holga always put her eggs on the stove to boil, and then stood over them with her arms folded, and Mrs. Hopewell would look at her, a kind of indirect gaze divided between her and Mrs. Freeman, and would think that if she would only keep herself up a little, she wouldn't be so bad-looking. There was nothing wrong with her face that a pleasant expression wouldn't help. Mrs. Hopewell said that people who looked on the bright side of things would be beautiful even if they were not. Whenever she looked at Joy this way, she could not help but feel that it would have been better if the child had not taken the Ph.D. It had certainly not brought her out any, and now that she had it, there was no more excuse for her to go to school again. Mrs. Hopewell thought it was nice for girls to go to school to have a good time, but Joy had gone through. Anyhow, she would not have been strong enough to go again. The doctors had told Mrs. Hopewell that with the best of care, Joy might see 45. She had a weak heart. Joy had made it plain that if it had not been for this condition, she would be far from these red hills and good country people. She would be in a university lecturing to people who knew what she was talking about, and Mrs. Hopewell could very well picture her there, looking like a scarecrow and lecturing to more of the same. Here she went about all day in a 6-year-old skirt and a yellow sweatshirt with a faded cowboy on a horse embossed on it. She thought this was funny. Mrs. Hopewell thought it was idiotic and showed simply that she was still a child. She was brilliant, but she didn't have a grain of sense. It seemed to Mrs. Hopewell that every year she grew less like other people and more like herself, bloated, rude, and squint-eyed. And she said such strange things. To her own mother she had said, without warning, without excuse, standing up in the middle of a meal with her face purple and her mouth half full, "Woman, do you ever look inside? Do you ever look inside and see what you are not? God!" she had cried, sinking down again and staring at her plate. Malebranche was right. We are not our own light. We are not our own light. Mrs. Hopewell had no idea to this day what brought that on. She had only made the remark, hoping Joy would take it in, that a smile would smile never hurt anyone. The girl had taken the Ph.D. in philosophy, and this left Mrs. Hopewell at a complete loss. You could say, "My daughter is a nurse," or "My daughter is a schoolteacher," or even "My daughter is a chemical engineer." You could not say, "My daughter is a philosopher." That was something that had ended with the Greeks and the Romans. All day Joy sat on her neck in a deep chair, reading. Sometimes she went for walks, but she didn't like dogs or cats or birds or flowers or nature or nice young men. She looked at nice young men as if she could smell their stupidity.